Have you ever wondered what you would do if the people you trusted most turned their backs on you? Imagine losing your home, your name, and even the clothes on your back, not to strangers, but to family. That was the cruel fate of Clara Mae, left exposed and broken on a dusty road in the Texas frontier. And then came a choice. A lone rancher named Silas Boone, a man of few words but unshakable conviction, stepped forward, with nothing more than a blanket and the strength of his presence. He made a statement, "You're coming with me." But what happens when one woman, with nothing left to lose, is offered shelter not by promises, but by silence and respect? What would you do if you had to trust a stranger to reclaim your dignity, your safety, maybe even your heart? This is not just a story about survival. It's about the quiet power of kindness, the resilience to rise again, and the courage it takes to start over. Stay with us, and let's walk together into Red Rock Hollow. And before we begin, don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this. "You're coming with me," Silas Boone said. His voice carried the weight of certainty, not a suggestion or a plea, but the unshakable tone of a man who did not bend once his mind was set. The dry Texas road had coated his boots, his horse, and even the pale skin of the woman before him in a thin veil of red dust. She stood exposed under the merciless afternoon sun, trembling but silent. A few paces away, her late husband's kin, the McAllisters, leaned against their wagon, their faces twisted with arrogance and satisfaction. They had completed their work, casting her out in a final humiliating act that robbed her not only of her home, but of the last shreds of dignity she possessed. The eldest, his expression as sharp as flint, S.P. Silas, did not owe with steady purpose. Silas swung down from the saddle. His movements were practiced, almost economical, every step deliberate. From the back of his horse he drew a wool blanket, worn but heavy, and walked toward her. Without a word, he draped it carefully over her shoulders, making sure his hands brushed nothing more than the fabric. It was Naughton. Only then did he turn to face the McAllisters. "Hi." The ride back to Red Rock Hollow unfolded in silence beneath a wide, indifferent sky. Clara Mae sat before him in the saddle, the coarse blanket wrapped close as if it might shield her from the memory of all she had lost. She felt the solid presence of his chest behind her, steady and unthreatening, offering nothing but space. She focused on the rhythm of the horse beneath them, the creak of leather, the dull thud of hooves against the dry ground, each sound carrying her farther from what had been taken from her. The wind swept low across the sage, whispering of distant storms. Silas rode with the kind of stillness that belonged to the land itself, his eyes scanning hills and canyons with the instinct of a man accustomed to both danger and solitude. He offered no words, no assurances she could not believe. Yet his silence was not harsh. It was a refuge. The sun lowered, throwing streaks of crimson and gold across the horizon, like wounds painted across the sky. The light touched the hard planes of his face, revealing years of labor carved into his skin. He looked as if he had been hewn from the same stone as the land. Yet there was an integrity in his bearing that spoke of safety. For the first time in years, Clara Mae felt a flicker of it. As twilight deepened, a single lantern glimmered ahead, a small, steady spark in the vast dark. Fear rose sharp in her chest. This was not a place she had chosen, but a destination nonetheless. Nestled in a quiet valley, his ranch came into view. It was unadorned, but solid, a weathered house, a barn, and the outlines of fences that stood like sentinels against the wilderness. A place built not for beauty, but endurance. Silas drew the horse to the trough, swung down, and then reached for her. His hands, rough and sure, circled her waist to lift her gently to the ground. Her knees buckled, but he steadied her without a word until she found her footing. Inside, the house carried the scent of wood smoke and old leather. A stone fireplace took up one wall. The furniture was plain but cared for. He pointed toward a door. "That room's yours. Clothes are on the bed. They belonged to my mother." He moved to the stove, striking a flame to life, filling the silence with the crackle of fire. Clara Mae stepped into the small room he had shown her. On the bed lay a cotton dress and a shift, washed clean and smelling faintly of sunshine and soap. She shed the heavy blanket, the last symbol of her humiliation, and dressed. The fabric hung loosely, but gave her a sense of cover, a beginning. When she returned, 2 plates of beans and bacon waited on the wooden table. They ate without speaking. The scrape of forks and the sigh of the fire, the only sounds between them. She watched him, this severe, quiet man who had intervened with a force as natural as a storm. He asked nothing, not even her name. For the first time, she realized that was a mercy. The mercy she had not expected revealed itself in silence. In those first days at Red Rock Hollow, time seemed to stretch in long, quiet lines, broken only by the rhythm of the sun and the endless demands of the land. Silas Boone rose before the light of morning touched the horizon. The creak of the floorboards under his boots was the only sound announcing his departure. He slipped out without fanfare, the door closing softly behind him, leaving the house still wrapped in the hush of dawn. Clara Mae often woke to the faint smell of coffee or the sight of a bowl of stew left waiting for her on the rough wooden table. Sometimes there was just a heel of bread, sometimes a plate of beans, but always enough to fill her. He never lingered at her door, never sought conversation, never pressed into the quiet she seemed to guard so fiercely. It was as though he knew her need for space, treating it like a tangible thing, something he could set in her hands and say, "Here, this belongs to you." Within the house, she moved like a ghost, silent on bare feet across cool plank floors. The place mirrored the man who had built it. Nothing in it was frivolous. Each chair, each tool, each scrap of cloth had a role. In the small room she now occupied, she discovered a narrow box tucked beneath a chest. Inside lay small treasures, a handful of carved wooden birds smoothed by time, a faded photograph of a stern-faced woman whose eyes held the same quiet steel as Silas's, and a chipped porcelain cup with its handle broken away. Clara Mae held the cup in her hands for a long while. It was cracked, imperfect, and yet still carried a fragile kind of beauty. She felt kinship with that useless little thing. Broken did not mean worthless. As the days passed, the air inside the house began to feel close, pressing down until she could hardly draw a deep breath. One afternoon, she stepped out onto the porch. The sunlight struck her face, sharp and honest, the breeze carrying with it the clean scent of sage and dust. Her gaze traveled over the valley, over the ridges that marked the edges of Red Rock Hollow, and there he was. Silas Boone stood some distance away, mending a stretch of fencing. His hammer rose and fell in a steady rhythm, each strike carrying through the still air like a heartbeat. He did not turn toward her, did not call out, but his arm paused for the barest moment. He knew she was watching. Then he bent again to his task, granting her presence the dignity of being acknowledged without spectacle. That moment was small, but to Clara Mae it was the first time she had stepped out of hiding. A week later, she saw the figure, a dark speck moving along the eastern ridge, a place where no rider had business being, too far to make out clearly. Yet the knowledge settled deep in her bones before her mind had even caught up. It was the McAllisters. She watched until her eyes stung, until the rider finally disappeared back over the ridge. But the damage was done. The valley that had begun to feel like refuge now seemed a cage with walls too thin to hold back what lingered outside. That evening, Silas came in from his chores. He did not speak of what she had seen, though she was certain he knew. Instead, he spread a piece of oilcloth across the table and laid his rifle upon it. The hiss of the lantern filled the silence as he broke the weapon down piece by piece, cleaning each with practiced precision. The scrape of metal, the click of parts fitting back together. These were his words. Clara Mae sat by the hearth, her hands knotted tightly in her lap. Watching him, she realized it was not aggression that guided him, but a solemn preparation. He was not sharpening a weapon to flaunt his strength. He was readying himself for the truth they both knew: danger lingered beyond the ridge, and it was patient. She understood then that his protection was not some passing gesture, not pity. It was a burden he had taken up, and one he did not intend to lay down. The air in the room grew thick with the weight of their shared awareness. Nothing was spoken, yet everything was understood. It was the cry of a ewe that tore her from uneasy sleep one night. A storm pressed hard from the north, the wind howling around the corners of the house, rattling shutters. Silas was already pulling on his boots, lantern in hand, by the time she reached the door. Some instinct she could not explain pushed her after him into the churning dark. They reached the small pen near the barn, where a ewe struggled in labor. The lamb turned wrong, fighting for breath. The lantern's light wavered in the wind, threatening to vanish at every gust. Silas knelt, his large hands working with calm urgency. He looked at her only once, his voice tight but steady. "Hold this." Clara Mae took the lantern. Her hand, though trembling, grew firm as she held the glass steady. She knelt in the straw, the storm tugging her hair loose, and fixed her eyes on the flame as if willing it to survive. Time became nothing but the sound of the ewe's labored breaths, Silas's low reassurances, the thrum of the storm, and then at last the lamb slipped free into his hands, limp and silent. Her heart stopped. Silas rubbed the small body with burlap, cleared its mouth and nose. For a long, desperate moment, nothing. Then a twitch, a gasp, and at last a thin cry. The sound of life. Relief swept through her so sharply the tears stung her eyes. They had done it, together. Silas settled the lamb with its mother, his face caught in the wavering glow of the lantern Clara Mae still held. His expression gave away little, but his eyes lingered on her longer than before. Back inside the house, rain drumming hard on the roof, Clara Mae found her voice. 2 small words broke the silence between them. "Thank you." Silas only nodded, yet that nod carried the weight of an entire conversation. In the days that followed, something shifted. The silence between them softened. It no longer carried the edge of necessity, but the warmth of understanding. Clara Mae began stepping outside more often, her feet finding their way to the small patch of ground behind the house where weeds had overrun an old garden. She found a trowel in the barn, rusted but serviceable, and set to pulling the weeds. Her hands grew dirty, her back sore, but there was something healing in the work, in coaxing life from the soil. Silas returned one afternoon to find a glass of water laced with mint waiting on the porch rail. He looked from the glass to her, sitting quietly on the steps, then drank it down in one pull. He gave her a short nod. Nothing more, but it was enough. The changes were small, but they began to knit themselves into something larger. She mended the tear in his work shirt with careful stitches. She swept the floors until the boards gleamed. These were not chores of servitude, but acts of belonging, of weaving herself into the fabric of life at Red Rock Hollow. Little by little, Clara Mae's silence was no longer the silence of fear, but of peace. The quiet between them no longer carried the edge of distance. It had softened, turning into something that felt like comfort. Clara Mae began to step out more each day. At first she lingered on the porch, drawing courage from the clean air that swept across Red Rock Hollow. Then she wandered farther, her hands sinking into the forgotten vegetable patch behind the house. She found an old trowel in the barn, its blade rusted and handle worn smooth from years of use, and began pulling weeds from the earth with a slow determination. The work gave her purpose. Each stubborn root she pried from the soil felt like a piece of herself being reclaimed. When she discovered a small spring of wild mint growing along the fence line, she began tending it carefully, coaxing it to thrive. The first time Silas Boone returned from the range to find a glass of cool water flavored with mint waiting on the porch rail, he stopped short. He studied the glass, then lifted his eyes to her where she sat quietly on the steps. Without a word, he drank it down, the nod of his head saying more than sentences ever could. She began taking on small tasks inside the house as well. A tear in his shirt was stitched with neat, practiced hands. The floor shone beneath her sweeping. These were not the duties of a servant, but the offerings of someone slowly weaving herself into the rhythm of another life. She was no longer a guest. She was building a place for herself here. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara Mae found her voice. It came low and steady, her words more like a ledger of facts than a plea for pity. She spoke of her late husband, a gentle but weak man, who had fallen to fever. She told how his family, the McAllisters, had seen her as nothing more than a failed bargain, another mouth to feed, a woman who had borne no heir. They had taken the farm, the livestock, and finally, in their last bitter act, stripped her of even the clothes on her back before casting her out. Silas did not interrupt. His gaze stayed fixed on the flames, his hands resting heavily on his knees. The only sign of his reaction was the muscle that tightened in his jaw, then loosened again, as though he were mastering a storm within himself. When she finished, silence settled over them both. But this silence was different. It was not born of avoidance. It was the weight of something finally spoken aloud, carried by two instead of one. That same day had been unsettled from the start. The sky had worn a bruised shade of purple, the cattle restless, their uneasy cries drifting across the pasture. Silas was fastening the barn door against the coming weather when he saw them. 3 riders cresting the eastern ridge, the very ridge where Clara Mae had once spotted a lone figure. This time they were close enough to leave no doubt. He straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, his face unreadable. Without hurry, he walked toward the house. Clara Mae was already on the porch, her fingers gripping the railing until her knuckles blanched. She had seen them, too. "Go inside," Silas said, his voice low but absolute. She hesitated, her wide eyes filled with the same fear that had followed her for months. "Inside," he repeated, softer this time, yet with a finality that left no room for argument. She stepped back through the door, leaving it cracked open. From within, she could see him take his place on the top step of the porch, tall and unmovable, his arms hanging easily at his sides. He did not fetch his rifle. He did not need to. The McAllisters rode into the yard, dust curling around their horses' hooves. The father, flanked by his two sons, reined his mount sharply. His thin lips twisted into a sneer. "We've come for what belongs to us. Boone, the woman," the younger son called out as he swung from the saddle, a rope coiled in his hand. "She's ours by right. Send her out." Silas's gaze never wavered. "She's not yours." The younger McAllister took a step closer, his grin cruel. "Law says otherwise. She goes with us." Silas' reply was quiet, but it cut through the rising wind like a blade. "She stays." The younger man lunged, but Silas moved with startling swiftness. He met him not with a weapon, but with the full force of his body, sending the man sprawling into the dirt. The father and the other brother's hands twitched toward their belts, but something in Silas's eyes stopped them cold. A fire burned there, cold and merciless, the kind of resolve they had never faced before. "Leave," Silas said, "and do not return." The words were not spoken as a warning, but as a truth already decided. The McAllisters hesitated, their confidence withering under the weight of his certainty. Finally, they dragged their fallen kin back onto his horse and turned away, their curses snatched by the wind. The first clap of thunder rolled overhead as they disappeared into the distance, and then the heavens split open, rain pouring down in torrents. The storm passed quickly, leaving the valley washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and sage, the colors of the world sharpened by the rain. The tension that had hung heavy for weeks had broken, swept away like dust. In its place was a deeper peace, born not of hiding, but of confrontation faced together and endured. From that day forward, their lives took on a new rhythm. Clara Mae no longer remained a shadow within the walls of the house. She worked beside Silas, learning to patch the roof, mend fence lines, and identify herbs growing along the hillsides. Her strength revealed itself in quiet resilience, the kind that did not falter but endured. Silas, in turn, softened in ways so small they might have been missed by anyone else. He would leave a wildflower on the table in the mornings. He would point out the hawk circling high above Red Rock Hollow. Words remained few between them, but they no longer needed them. Their language lived in the sharing of work, in small glances, in the comfort of knowing someone else was there. One afternoon, Silas returned from the pasture and paused in the doorway. Clara Mae stood by the window, sunlight falling across her face. On the sill rested the porcelain cup she had once found broken. She had pieced it back together with painstaking care. The cracks were still there, thin dark lines tracing across the porcelain like scars. But it was whole again, and no longer empty. She had filled it with tiny purple blossoms gathered from the creek. Silas walked closer, his rough hand reaching out to touch one of the petals, so fragile against the callous strength of his fingers. Then he looked at her, for the first time since she had known him. His stern face broke into a smile. It was small, slow, but it lit him from within. In that moment, Red Rock Hollow was no longer simply his home. It had become theirs. Through the turning of the seasons, autumn's gold, winter's silence, spring's tender green, they built a life together. It was not a life of grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but one of steady partnership, of labor shared and burdens halved. The scars of their pasts remained, but they no longer defined them. Like the mended teacup, they bore their cracks openly, proof not of their breaking, but of their strength to endure and to be made whole again. And on a clear spring morning, standing together on the porch of the house, in Red Rock Hollow, watching the sun climb over the same ridge where once a threat had appeared, Clara Mae and Silas Boone knew they had built more than a ranch. They had built a sanctuary, a world of their own. On the kitchen windowsill sat the porcelain cup Clara Mae had once held in her trembling hands. Weeks earlier, it had been nothing but a broken fragment of another life, its handle gone, its surface spidered with cracks. Now it had been carefully pieced back together, each line visible like scars across porcelain. But the cup was no longer empty. She had filled it with tiny blossoms she gathered from the creek bed, purple flowers that thrived where little else grew. Silas Boone paused when he noticed it. For a long time he said nothing, only studying the little vessel with its fragile defiance. His rough fingers brushed against a petal, the contrast between his calloused hand and its tender surface striking in its simplicity. When his eyes lifted to hers across the room, Clara Mae saw something shift. His stern face, always so steady, softened, slowly, almost hesitantly. He smiled. It was not wide or showy, but it carried the warmth of the sun after a long winter. In that smile lay a promise. The house was no longer his alone. It was theirs. The seasons turned over them as surely as pages in a book. The valley wore its many coats, golden leaves of fall, the sharp white of winter, and then again the green shoots of spring. Life at Red Rock Hollow found its rhythm, not in declarations, but in the ordinary work of each day. They rose with the sun, tended cattle, mended what broke, and ended their evenings by the fire. No grand vows were spoken, yet everything between them spoke of a partnership, a quiet devotion forged in routine and respect. They were building something far stronger than words. Together, they crafted a sanctuary, born from a single moment of defiance against cruelty and shaped by countless patient hours afterward. The world outside might have carried on with its chaos, but in that small valley, two wounded souls found room to breathe again. They became like trees planted side by side, their roots tangled beneath the soil, drawing strength from one another. Their scars did not vanish. Clara Mae carried the memory of humiliation dealt to her by the McAllisters. Silas bore years of solitude and hardship etched into the lines of his face, yet those marks no longer defined them. Instead, they reminded them both of the strength it takes to endure. The cracks in their lives, much like the mended cup, had not destroyed them. They had made them whole in a different way. On one clear morning, spring sunlight spilled across the porch. Silas and Clara Mae stood together, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge, the very ridge where once a shadow of threat had lingered. But no fear touched them now, only peace. What they had built was greater than fences and barns. They had built a world of their own. Life has a way of breaking us in places we never expect. For Clara Mae and Silas Boone, their scars were visible in different ways, hers in the humiliation and loss she endured, his in the long solitude of a hard land. Yet their story reminds us of something simple and profound. Being whole does not mean being flawless. The cracks remain, but they tell the story of what we survived. For those of us who have lived long enough to carry our share of burdens, it's easy to believe that healing must come in great triumphs. But often, it comes in smaller moments, planting a garden, mending a shirt, or simply sitting in silence beside someone who cares. Those quiet acts of persistence are what turn an empty house into a home, and strangers into companions. The lesson here is one we can all carry. Resilience is not about pretending we were never broken, but about choosing to piece ourselves back together and allowing others to walk alongside us. No matter our age, it is never too late to find strength in gentleness and to build a life that is steady, honest, and shared. Thank you for spending your time with us today and letting this story touch your heart. If Clara Mae and Silas Boone's journey spoke to you, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who would be moved by it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means we can keep bringing you more stories of love, resilience, and hope from the American frontier.